So, speaking of pattern interrupts, a couple of years ago, I had been hired to do some work with a group of people who had telesales teams, and it was on sales call reluctance, which is basically when someone's getting a sense of hesitation to do something and that sort of thing. And I don't know if you know or not, but there are basically 3 things that have been identified by John Grinder and maybe by Bandler as well as being the things that are sort of barriers to learning and progress. And one of them is internal dialogue. One of them is focal vision rather than peripheral vision. And the third one is a feeling of hesitation. And that's what sales call reluctance is about. You know, does everyone know what I mean by sales call reluctance? Not wanting to pick up the phone and call because not fear of rejection or whatever it might be. And so I was going in to do a piece of work with them, and I was reading a book on the tube on the way in. This is when I lived in London. A book called Change by a guy called Paul Watzlawick. Watzlawick was a very, very interesting guy. His books are excellent, and very interested in communication and how human beings communicate and change. And he was, one of these people who was coming from the perspective that you can change anything. In fact, I heard a great story about Watzlawick. He was speaking at a conference, and this was, I think, back in the 60s when the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, of schizophrenia in general, had just been created. It had been developed as a label for certain classes of behavior. And Watzlawick was speaking at the conference, and someone put their hand up and asked, Dr. Watzlawick, how do you deal with schizophrenic patients? And he furrowed his brow and he looked around and he says, just remind me that there's no known cure for schizophrenia, is there? And the person said, no, there's not. He said, then I would just never diagnose any of my clients as having it. Which is a great frame. Why diagnose someone as having something you can't help them with? So I kind of like that. I always assume that there's something I can do. Having said that, if someone's got certain symptoms and I think they need to see a doctor, then I'll tell them to. I'll say, I'll tell them to get their GP to check them out or whatever it might be. But I also assume that mind and body are one system, and that there's going to be an interaction between those two aspects of themselves. Anyway, so I was reading this book, and he told a story in it about a guy who had been writing his doctoral thesis, but the more he wrote, the bigger the thesis got. Seems obvious in a way, but the more he wrote, the more he had to footnote what he was doing and that sort of thing. And as Watzlawick talked to him, it turned out that this chap had come from a large immigrant family, and he was the only one who had been to university. And so with his thesis, he was terrified of making a mistake, terrified of failing. And everyone was saying to him, you're great, you can do this brilliantly, you're really, really good, get out there and do it. But he was still kind of just worrying about it. And so every time he wrote a new paragraph, he would add a page of footnotes and footnotes on the footnotes and that sort of thing. Just talk about a huge amount of internal dialogue, and he just needed to switch it off. And so he went to Watzlawick, and Watzlawick said, okay, I get what's going on. So he said to the guy, he said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go into a commercial premises, like a retail premises, a shop, today, he said, and I want you to make an absurd request. Ask them for something that would be ridiculous to ask for. And he said, I want you to do it with a straight face, as though you're just stupid or something. Go into a lighting shop and ask for some groceries, or go into a grocery shop and ask for some hardware, or whatever it might be. So I read this and I thought, oh, that's amazing. I'll get these sales guys to do that. That'll be great. That'll be really interesting. Then I thought, hang on, that's a bit full on. I'm not gonna, because I've got a thing. I basically go, don't get your clients to do something you wouldn't do yourself. So I thought, well, I really want them to do this, and I think it'll be really cool and memorable. So I better do it myself. So I got off the tube once it stopped, and because safety first. I went up, and the first thing I came across was a McDonald's in High Street, Kensington, and so went straight over, walked up to the counter, and when it was funny thing is, my heart was beating like a drum because I knew what I was going to do. And it's the strangest thing because my body was reacting as though I was going into a very terrifying situation. Now here's the thing, I've done firewalking with Tony Robbins and that sort of thing, and it didn't have any of that sort of effect because I knew on a deep level it was totally safe, you know? But for some reason doing this, going into McDonald's to make an absurd request seemed frightening because it was stepping outside of the social matrix of what I considered to be, you know, appropriate, and risking being seen as stupid and unlike everyone else, and, you know, making a mistake and all that sort of stuff. And I wanted to run away, but I stayed with it. And I got to the front of the queue and she said, you know, how may I help you? And I said, I'll have a ham and pineapple pizza. And she said, what? I said, I'll have a ham and pineapple pizza. And she goes, we don't sell ham and pineapple pizza. I go, this is a Chinese restaurant, isn't it? And she's like, no. I'm like, oh, sorry, thanks anyway. And I turned around and walked out. I felt like $1,000,000. It felt absolutely amazing, just these amazing feeling of freedom and liberation. So I thought, got to do this, got to do this. And so I went and I told this story to the group, and I got them to go out at lunchtime, and they came back reporting the same sort of thing. You know, they'd gone into Marks and Spencer's lingerie section and asked for a pound of apples, or they'd gone, you know, they'd done various things, just making absurd requests with a straight face. And it did all sorts of interesting things.